The morning sun cast long shadows across the empty ranch house in rural Arizona, where Sarah Martinez had lived for 3 years with her late husband, David. The silence was deafening. No more coffee brewing at 5 a.m., no more boots on the wooden porch, no more gentle laughter filling the rooms. David had been gone for 2 months now, taken by a heart attack at just 42, leaving Sarah to navigate grief while managing their struggling cattle ranch alone. The isolation that once felt peaceful now felt suffocating. Their nearest neighbors were the Yazzie family, living 15 miles away on the Navajo Nation reservation. Thomas Yazzie, a 35-year-old former Marine and current search and rescue specialist, had offered help several times since David's funeral, but Sarah's pride kept her from accepting. She was determined to prove she could handle everything herself. On this particular Tuesday morning, Sarah was feeding the remaining cattle when she heard the rumble of multiple vehicles approaching. 3 dusty pickup trucks emerged from the desert road, kicking up clouds of red dirt. Her stomach dropped as she recognized the lead vehicle. It belonged to Marcus Kane, a local land developer who'd been pressuring her to sell the ranch for months. But Kane wasn't alone this time. He'd brought 5 other men, all wearing the hard expressions of people accustomed to getting what they wanted through intimidation. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her phone, but she realized with growing panic that she'd left it inside the house. "Mrs. Martinez," Kane called out, his voice carrying false friendliness. "We need to talk business." "I told you, the ranch isn't for sale," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite her racing heart. The cattle sensed her fear and began to shift restlessly in their pen. Kane's smile disappeared. "I'm afraid that's not really an option anymore. You see, you've missed 3 mortgage payments, the bank's ready to foreclose, and I'm prepared to make a very generous offer, much more than you'd get at auction." "That's a lie. I've been making payments," Sarah said, though uncertainty crept into her voice. Had she missed something in her grief-stricken haze? "Paperwork says otherwise." Kane nodded to his men, who began to spread out around the property. "Now, you can sign these papers willingly, or we can wait for the sheriff to evict you next week. But either way, you're leaving today." Sarah's mind raced. Something was wrong. She'd been careful with the mortgage payments, knowing they were her lifeline to keeping David's dream alive, but surrounded by 6 men in the middle of nowhere, she felt her options disappearing. "I need to call my lawyer," she said, taking a step back toward the house. "No calls," Kane said firmly. "This gets settled now. Boys, help Mrs. Martinez pack her essentials. She's coming with us to finalize the paperwork in town." The men moved closer, and Sarah realized with growing horror that this wasn't a legal proceeding. It was a kidnapping disguised as a business transaction. Kane's paperwork was likely forged, and once she was isolated with them, there would be no witnesses to whatever they planned to do to force her signature. "Get away from me," Sarah shouted, but her voice seemed to disappear into the vast Arizona landscape. She ran toward the house, hoping to reach her phone and call for help, but 2 of Kane's men intercepted her, easily. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," one of them said, grabbing her arm with unnecessary force. "We're just going for a little drive." As they forced her toward the trucks, Sarah's eyes swept the horizon desperately. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by messes and scattered vegetation. No one would hear her scream. No one would know she was gone until it was too late. The last thing she saw before they shoved her into the truck was the ranch house David had built with his own hands, standing empty and abandoned under the merciless Arizona sun. 15 miles away, Thomas Yazzie was preparing for another day of search and rescue training when his grandmother, Elena, arrived at his trailer with a troubled expression. At 78, Elena Yazzie was considered a wisdom keeper in their community, and Thomas had learned long ago to take her concerns seriously. "Something's wrong at the Martinez place," she said without preamble, settling into the chair on his small porch. "The cattle are calling out, distressed. I heard them from my morning walk." Thomas paused in checking his gear. "Sarah's probably just running late with feeding. She's still adjusting to managing everything alone." "No," Elena said firmly. "These aren't hungry cattle sounds. These are animals in distress because their human is gone. I've heard it before." Thomas looked at his grandmother's weathered face, seeing the certainty there. Elena had an uncanny ability to sense when something was wrong, a skill that had served their family well for decades. During his military service in Afghanistan, her bad feelings had prompted him to call home just in time to help with various family emergencies. "I'll drive over and check," Thomas said, already changing his plans for the day. Probably nothing, but better safe than sorry. The drive to the Martinez Ranch took him through some of the most beautiful and desolate country in Arizona. Red rock formations jutted from the desert floor like ancient monuments, while saguaro cacti stood sentinel against the endless blue sky. Thomas had grown up in this landscape, learning to read its signs and secrets from his father and grandfather, both of whom had served as tribal police officers. As he approached the ranch, Thomas immediately noticed what had alarmed his grandmother. The cattle were indeed agitated, bunched together in their pen and lowing continuously. Sarah's horse, a gentle mare named Luna, was pacing frantically in the corral. These weren't the sounds of animals waiting for food. These were the sounds of animals whose routine had been violently disrupted. Thomas parked his truck and approached the house cautiously. The front door was standing open, swinging gently in the desert breeze. Inside, he could see signs of a struggle: a chair overturned, papers scattered on the floor, Sarah's purse abandoned on the kitchen counter with her phone. Still inside, his military training kicked in as he surveyed the scene. Multiple sets of boot prints in the dirt outside, tire tracks from several vehicles, and most telling of all, clear signs that someone had been dragged from the porch to where the trucks had been parked. Thomas pulled out his phone and called the local sheriff's office, though he knew from experience that help would be hours away. The ranch was in a jurisdictional gray area, and coordinating between county, state, and federal agencies took time that Sarah might not have. While waiting for the call back, Thomas began to do what he did best: read the story the landscape was telling him. The tire tracks were fresh, made within the last few hours. 3 vehicles, all heavy trucks, based on the depth of the impressions. They'd headed east, toward the interstate, but Thomas knew the desert better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. There were dozens of abandoned mining camps, old ranch buildings, and hidden canyons in that direction. Perfect places to hide someone while forcing them to sign documents or worse. The kidnappers had at least a 2-hour head start, but they were traveling in vehicles, on roads. Thomas had other options. He called his supervisor at the search and rescue unit and requested immediate leave, then loaded his specialized tracking equipment into his truck. As he worked, he found himself thinking about Sarah Martinez, the quiet dignity with which she'd handled her husband's death, the stubborn independence that had kept her from accepting help, the way she'd tried to keep David's dream alive, even as it slowly killed her financially. Thomas had been drawn to her strength. From the moment they'd met at David's funeral, she'd stood at the graveside like a pillar of granite, comforting others even as her own world crumbled. In the months since, he'd found excuses to check on her, always keeping his distance but making sure she knew she wasn't completely alone. Now, loading his rifle and emergency medical supplies into the truck, Thomas admitted to himself what he'd been avoiding for months. His concern for Sarah went beyond neighborly courtesy or professional obligation. Somewhere in the process of watching her grieve and fight and survive, he'd fallen in love with her courage. The sheriff's office called back with bureaucratic delays and jurisdictional questions. But Thomas was already driving east, following the tire tracks that were becoming fainter as the desert wind began to erase them. He had maybe 6 hours of daylight left, and Sarah was out there somewhere, probably terrified and possibly hurt. He thought about his grandmother's words: "These are animals in distress, because their human is gone." Alina was right, as usual, but if Thomas had anything to say about it, Sarah Martinez was coming home. The abandoned copper mine where Marcus Kane had taken Sarah was a relic from Arizona's mining boom, hidden deep in a canyon 20 miles from the nearest road. The main building, a weathered structure of corrugated metal and rotting wood, provided shelter from the desert sun while remaining invisible to casual observation. Kane had used the location before for business meetings that required privacy and intimidation. Sarah sat in a wooden chair in the center of the main room, her hands zip-tied behind her back. The 6 men had been taking turns trying to convince her to sign the forged documents, alternating between fake friendliness and barely veiled threats. Her ranch deed lay on a makeshift table, alongside papers that would transfer the property to Kane's development company for a fraction of its value. "This is getting ridiculous, Mrs. Martinez," Kane said, mopping sweat from his forehead with a dirty handkerchief. "We've been at this for 3 hours. Just sign the papers, and you can go home." "Home to what?" Sarah asked, her voice hoarse from the dry air and stress. "You're stealing my ranch. David's ranch. Everything we built together. Your husband's dead," Kane replied coldly. "Dead men don't need ranches." Live women need to be practical about their situations. Sarah looked around the room at the men who held her captive. They were all locals. She recognized 2 of them from the hardware store in town. How many other people were involved in Kane's scheme? How many people had looked the other way while he systematically targeted struggling property owners? The mortgage payments, she said suddenly. You've been intercepting them somehow, making it look like I was behind. Kane's smile was all the confirmation she needed. Banking errors happen all the time, especially when you have friends in the right places. Outside, the desert was beginning to show signs of the approaching evening. The temperature was dropping, and Sarah could hear the distant call of coyotes beginning their nightly hunt. She thought about her cattle, probably still distressed and unfed. She thought about Luna, her mare, who would be wondering why her evening grain hadn't arrived. Most of all, she thought about David, and how he'd made her promise to fight for their dreams no matter what happened to him. She'd been so focused on her grief that she'd missed the signs of Kane's conspiracy, but she wouldn't give up now. I'm not signing anything, she said firmly. Meanwhile, 20 miles away, Thomas Yazzie was demonstrating why he'd been one of the most effective trackers. In his Marine unit, the tire tracks had disappeared on the hard-pan desert floor, but Thomas was reading signs that most people would never notice: displaced pebbles, broken vegetation, even the flight patterns of disturbed birds. His phone had lost signal hours ago, cutting him off from backup, but Thomas pressed on. He'd switched from his truck to his motorcycle, a modified dirt bike that could handle the rough terrain while moving fast enough to cover ground quickly. The sun was getting low, casting long shadows that actually made tracking easier by highlighting subtle changes in the landscape at a water tank used by local ranchers. Thomas found fresh tire tracks in the mud. 3 vehicles, just as he'd calculated, and they'd stopped long enough for someone to get out and walk around. One set of smaller footprints caught his attention: a woman's boot, size 7, with a distinctive wear pattern on the right heel that he'd noticed on Sarah's boots during his previous visits to the ranch. Thomas followed the trail up a narrow canyon that wound deeper into the desert. The tracks were getting fresher, meaning he was closing the gap. But the sun was also getting lower, and once darkness fell, his tracking would become nearly impossible. As he rounded a bend in the canyon, Thomas spotted something that made him kill the motorcycle's engine and coast to a stop. Ahead, barely visible through the desert vegetation, was the metallic glint of vehicles parked near what looked like an old mine building. Thomas left his bike hidden behind a boulder and crept forward on foot. Using skills learned in both military service and traditional hunting techniques passed down through generations of his family, the building was about 200 yards away. Positioned to be invisible from the air, but accessible by the rough road the kidnappers had used. Through a gap in the metal siding, Thomas could see inside the building. Sarah was there, tied to a chair, surrounded by 6 men who were clearly growing impatient with her refusal to cooperate. One of them, a man in an expensive shirt who was clearly the leader, was waving papers in her face while shouting something Thomas couldn't make out. Thomas counted weapons. 3 of the men had handguns visible, and there were probably more hidden. He was outnumbered 6 to 1, with no backup and no way to call for help. The tactical situation was about as bad as it could get. But as Thomas watched Sarah lift her chin defiantly in the face of her captor's threats, he knew he couldn't wait for backup that might never come. Every minute she remained in that building was another minute for the situation to escalate beyond the point of no return. Thomas began to plan his approach, using the gathering darkness and his knowledge of the terrain. He'd been in worse situations, in Afghanistan, though admittedly never with stakes this personal. As he checked his equipment and calculated angles of approach, Thomas found himself thinking about something his grandfather had told him years ago: sometimes the most important battles are the ones you fight alone. The desert around him was settling into its evening rhythm, the daytime hunters giving way to the creatures of the night. Soon, Thomas would join them in the hunt. But his prey wasn't an animal. His prey was 6 men who'd made the mistake of taking someone he cared about. As the sun disappeared behind the canyon walls, Thomas Yazzie moved like a shadow through the desert scrub surrounding the old mine. He'd spent the last hour studying the building's layout, identifying entry points, and observing the patterns of the men inside. The kidnappers had grown careless as the day wore on, assuming their remote location made them safe from discovery. Through the gaps in the metal siding, Thomas could see that the situation inside was deteriorating. Kane had grown increasingly frustrated with Sarah's refusal to sign the documents, and his men were suggesting more aggressive tactics. Time was running out. Thomas had identified the building's weak points. A section of corrugated metal that had pulled away from its frame, creating a gap just large enough for him to squeeze through. But first, he needed to create a distraction that would draw some of the men outside and improve his odds. Moving silently to where the kidnappers had parked their trucks, Thomas used his knife to slash the tires on two of the vehicles. Then, using techniques learned from his grandfather's stories about traditional hunting, he began to create sounds in the desert that would suggest the presence of a large animal, possibly a mountain lion or bear. The effect was immediate. Two of Cain's men came outside to investigate, leaving for inside with Sarah. Thomas waited until they were far enough from the building, then used a sling to send a rock crashing into the metal siding on the opposite side of the structure. As the men ran toward the sound, Thomas slipped through his chosen entry point. Inside the building, the remaining 4 men were focused on Sarah, who was now refusing to even look at the documents Cain kept waving in her face. Thomas could hear her voice, steady despite her obvious fear. "I told you, I'm not signing anything. Kill me if you want, but I won't help you steal my husband's ranch." Thomas felt a surge of admiration for her courage, followed immediately by a cold tactical assessment of the situation. He was positioned behind a pile of old mining equipment, with a clear shot at 2 of the men and partial cover from the others. But Sarah was directly in the line of fire. Any shooting would put her at risk. Instead, Thomas decided to use the element of surprise more subtly. He picked up a piece of metal debris and threw it against the far wall. As the men turned toward the sound, Thomas moved closer, using the shadows and abandoned equipment for cover. "What the hell was that?" one of the men muttered, drawing his gun. "Probably just the wind," Cain replied, but Thomas could hear the tension in his voice. "Rodriguez, Santos, go check it out." As 2 more men moved away from Sarah, Thomas saw his opportunity. He was now close enough to reach Cain and the remaining guard, a nervous-looking man, who kept glancing toward the door as if expecting trouble. Thomas made his move with the silent efficiency of a trained soldier. He emerged from cover like a ghost, striking the nervous guard with a precise blow that dropped him unconscious before he could cry out. Cain spun around, reaching for his gun, but Thomas was already there. "Don't," Thomas said quietly, his hand on Cain's wrist, preventing him from drawing his weapon. "Let's not wake up the whole desert." Cain's eyes widened as he took in Thomas's appearance. The desert camouflage, the tactical gear, the calm confidence of someone who'd done this before. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm the man who's taking Mrs. Martinez home," Thomas replied, relieving Cain of his weapon. "Sarah, are you hurt?" "Thomas." Sarah's voice was filled with disbelief and hope. "How did you find me?" "Your cattle were worried about you," Thomas said, moving to cut her restraints while keeping his eyes on Cain. "My grandmother heard them." As Sarah's hands came free, she immediately tried to stand, but her legs were shaky from hours of being tied up. Thomas caught her arm, steadying her, and for a moment their eyes met in the dim light of the building. "Thank you," she whispered, and Thomas heard a lifetime of gratitude in those 2 words. The reunion was interrupted by the return of Cain's men from outside. Thomas quickly assessed the situation. They were still outnumbered, and now the element of surprise was gone. But he had Sarah free, and that changed everything. "This way," Thomas said, leading Sarah toward his entry point. But before they could reach it, the 2 men from outside appeared at the main entrance, guns drawn. "Nobody move," one of them shouted. Thomas positioned himself between Sarah and the armed men, his mind racing through tactical options. The building had limited cover, multiple armed opponents, an innocent civilian in the crossfire. It was exactly the kind of situation his military training had prepared him for, but it never got easier when the stakes were personal. "Let her go," Thomas said calmly. "This is between you and me now." Cain laughed harshly. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're 1 man against 6, and you're in the middle of nowhere. Even if you get out of this building alive, you'll never make it back to civilization." "Maybe," Thomas replied, "but Mrs. Martinez will vent. That's all that matters." What happened next unfolded with the swift violence of a desert storm. Thomas had positioned himself near an overturned table, which he flipped toward the men at the entrance while simultaneously throwing Sarah behind the cover of the mining equipment. Gunshots rang out, echoing off the metal walls. But Thomas was already moving, using his knowledge of the building's layout to stay ahead of his opponents. The fight was brief but intense. Thomas's military training and intimate knowledge of combat in confined spaces gave him advantages that Cain's men couldn't match. When the dust settled, 3 men were unconscious, 2 were nursing injuries and no longer interested in fighting. And Cain was sitting on the floor with his hands zip-tied behind his back. Sarah emerged from cover, her eyes wide with shock and adrenaline. Is it over? It's over, Thomas confirmed, though he was already thinking about the next steps. We need to get out of here and get you to safety. Can you walk? Sarah nodded, testing her legs. I think so. But Thomas, those documents they're forged. Cain has been intercepting my mortgage payments, making it look like I was behind. There are others involved. People at the bank, maybe even the sheriff's office. Thomas looked at the scattered papers on the floor, then at Cain, who was glaring at them with undisguised hatred. We'll figure it out. Right now, the important thing is getting you home. As they prepared to leave the building, Sarah caught Thomas's arm. Why did you come? How did you know? Thomas looked at her in the dim light, seeing the strength that had carried her through months of grief and tonight's ordeal. Because someone had to. And because ... He paused, then decided this wasn't the time for complicated explanations. Because you're not alone, Sarah. You've never been alone. The desert night was cold and clear as they slowly made their way back to Thomas's motorcycle, their footsteps crunching softly against the sand and loose stone. A vast stillness surrounded them, the kind of silence that only exists far from cities, far from noise, far from everything that once seemed so urgent and overwhelming. The air had a sharpness to it, crisp and biting, yet invigorating, as if the land itself was stripped down to its bare essence. Raw and honest. Above them, the sky stretched wide and endless, a canvas of stars burning brightly in the darkness. Constellations she couldn't name shimmered like ancient watchful eyes, and the Milky Way glowed faintly like a silver river suspended in the heavens. Sarah tilted her head back, momentarily mesmerized by the sheer magnitude of it all. It made her feel small, yes, but not in a way that frightened her. It reminded her that life was bigger than grief, bigger than fear, bigger even than the canyon they had just left behind. Her thoughts drifted uninvited but welcome to David. She could almost see his face in the starlight, hear his laughter, on the wind. The ache in her chest was still there, but it had shifted somehow. It no longer felt like an open wound, but something deeper, quieter, a scar, perhaps, that would always be with her but didn't define her anymore. She thought of the ranch, of the life they had built together, and the dreams they had once shared. For so long, she had believed all of that had died with him, but now she wasn't so sure. Somewhere inside her, a quiet hope stirred, tentative, fragile, but real. The future she had once mourned wasn't gone. It had simply changed shape. It might never look like the life she had planned, but that didn't mean it couldn't be meaningful. Beautiful, even. She glanced at Thomas, walking just a few steps ahead, the moonlight outlining his silhouette. She didn't know what lay ahead for them. Didn't even fully understand what this night meant between them, but she knew she wasn't walking back alone. That, in itself, was enough for now. Behind them, the abandoned mine building stood silent in the darkness, holding its secrets and its prisoners until the authorities could arrive. But ahead of them, the lights of civilization beckoned, and with them, the promise of justice and the possibility of a new beginning. As Thomas started the motorcycle and the engine roared to life, breaking the stillness of the desert night, Sarah climbed on behind him. She wrapped her arms tightly around his waist, pressing herself close as the machine rumbled beneath them. With every bump and jolt of the rough terrain, she felt the steadiness in his posture, the confidence in the way he navigated the winding path back to the main road. The cold night air brushed against her cheeks. But there was a new warmth building inside her, not from the desert or the engine, but from within. It was in that moment, as the shadows of the canyon receded behind them, that Sarah realized how profoundly the night had changed her. She was no longer just a grieving widow clinging to memories and trying to survive one day at a time. Something inside her had shifted. She had looked her deepest fears in the eye, stepped into the darkness with no promise of light at the other end, and yet, here she was, stronger, steadier, more alive than she had felt in years. And she was no longer alone. The desert night embraced them like a quiet witness, its endless sky full of stars whispering promises of something new. The road ahead stretched into the unknown, but for the first time in a long time, the unknown didn't feel terrifying, it felt like a beginning. There was no telling what awaited them when the sun rose, but she felt ready. Ready for the uncertainty, ready for the struggle, ready for the chance to start again. Behind them, the canyon kept its silence, its secrets tucked away in the rocks and shadows, but ahead, the future opened wide, full of potential, full of paths they hadn't dared imagine until now. And this time, whatever came, they would face it together. Sarah Martinez stood on the weathered wooden porch of her ranch house, her calloused hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee as she watched the sunrise paint the vast desert landscape in brilliant shades of gold, amber, and deep crimson. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the familiar scent of sage and dry earth that had become her anchor in this new chapter of her life. The cattle dotting the pasture were healthy and well-fed, their coats gleaming in the early light, a testament to the care and dedication she'd poured into rebuilding what had once seemed lost forever. The mortgage payments were not only current but ahead of schedule. Cain's banking accomplices had been thoroughly exposed and prosecuted, their fraudulent schemes unraveled thread by thread, leaving Sarah's legal ownership of the ranch unquestionable and secure. The ranch itself was thriving in ways that would have made David's heart swell with pride. New fencing stretched across the property in clean, straight lines. The barn had been repaired and expanded, its fresh coat of red paint gleaming like a beacon against the desert backdrop. The water system had been upgraded, ensuring her livestock would never want for the precious resource that meant survival in this harsh but beautiful land. Every improvement, every small victory, felt like a tribute to the man who had first shared this dream with her, while simultaneously representing her own strength and determination to honor that legacy. Thomas, Yazzy's familiar blue pickup truck, was parked in the gravel driveway, dust still settling on its hood from his morning arrival. He'd been spending more time at the ranch lately, initially coming to help with repairs and improvements. His skilled hands could fix anything from a broken water pump to a stubborn gate latch, but as the weeks had turned into months, his visits had evolved into something deeper and more meaningful. He came now not just to work, but to simply enjoy Sarah's company as she slowly healed from her ordeal, learning to trust again, learning to laugh again, learning to live again without the shadow of grief and fear that had haunted her for so long. The legal proceedings had been swift and decisive once the FBI took over the case from the overwhelmed local authorities. Cain's elaborate land fraud scheme, investigators discovered, had been operating for years like a cancer across the region, systematically targeting vulnerable property owners across 3 counties. Widows, elderly farmers, families in financial distress had been prey to his sophisticated network of corruption that reached into banks, county offices, and legal firms. Sarah's harrowing rescue had provided the crucial evidence needed to bring down the entire operation, her testimony serving as the keystone that allowed prosecutors to build an airtight case against every participant in the conspiracy. But more than the legal victory, more than the financial security, the night in the desert had taught Sarah something profoundly important about herself. She was stronger than she'd ever imagined possible, braver than she'd ever been tested to be, and deserving of a love that went beyond grief and mere survival. The woman who had cowered in fear just months ago was gone, replaced by someone who had looked death in the eye and emerged, not broken, but transformed. The desert had been her crucible, and she had emerged from it tempered like steel. As Thomas joined her on the porch, his boots making familiar sounds on the old wooden boards, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the quiet, genuine smile she'd grown to love, a smile that spoke of patience, understanding, and a deep well of compassion that matched her own. Sarah realized that sometimes the most important rescues aren't from external dangers. Sometimes, the most important rescue is learning to save yourself, to believe in your own worth, your own strength, your own capacity for joy. And sometimes, it's about being brave enough to let someone else save you too, to open your heart to the possibility that love can bloom even in the harshest soil, even after the deepest loss. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a vast expanse of beauty and harshness, full of secrets both ancient and new. The same landscape that had nearly claimed her life now seemed to pulse with promise and possibility. But Sarah Martinez was no longer afraid of what it might hold. She'd faced the darkness that lived both in the world and in her own heart, and emerged into the light of a new dawn. Whatever came next, drought or prosperity, challenges or triumph, she wouldn't face it alone. The desert had taught her that survival wasn't just about enduring, it was about finding the courage to truly live.